So next I'd like to invite Dr. Sandy Hodgetts up. Dr. Hodgetts is an assistant professor in the Department of Occupational Therapy at the University of Alberta. She has also worked clinically with persons with autism and their families for over 15 years. Her research focuses on improving social inclusion and participation for people with autism by addressing external factors including peers, employers, and the general society. So please join me in welcoming Sandy. All right, so I just wanted to say thank you for having me here. These kind of days are really important and they're really fun. It's good to get out of sort of the research lab and back into the real world. So thanks for that. So I know it said I'm looking at vocational opportunities, which I am, or talking about that. Before I start, just acknowledging my team members on this project. So David Nicholas, who some of you probably know, and Margalera Rashid, who's a postdoc fellow who's been on this project. And I don't know if some of you may or may not have participated in this project. And it is funded through the Ontario Ministry of Community Social Services and policy-wise. We all know that there's multiple markers of employment success. This is a model that's been published by Dr. Zwagenbaum and others across the country, just sort of looking at all those multifaceted components that are required for success. So of course included in that are individual factors. The Worktopia program is addressing a lot of those factors. The family support, some of those sort of policy or resource factors. But I think we're all aware that those are important pieces, but they're not enough if employers still won't hire people with autism. So the point of our study was to really focus on that employer piece. So how do we better understand sort of what facilitators and barriers employers find to supporting people with autism, supporting employees with autism. So as far as we know, this is the first study that's really focused or tried to focus on that employer piece by including multiple perspectives. So we have collected data across Edmonton, Calgary, as well as a number of cities in Ontario. This is hot off the press. We are actually still collecting data, but we are interviewing employers, employment support workers, persons with autism and other developmental disabilities, and their caregivers. So we are still recruiting caregivers and employers. As I go through these data, I think it's important to note right now our employer sample we realized is really biased. So all of those sponsors that Wendy and Jackie put up for Worktopia, those are a lot of the type of people who we're interviewing. So what we're doing now is we're actually trying to contact people like my Uncle Bob, who owns a home renovation company, and saying, okay, so do you know anything about autism? What would help you hire someone or not? So those data, unfortunately, aren't here yet, but when they come, I think they're going to be very important. So what I thought I'd do today is just highlight our 4 key themes that are emerging from these data that you can use as sort of tips and tricks to help you or your family members or people you're working with, depending on what your background is, to maybe help get some meaningful employment opportunities for people with autism. I think for the sake of time, I'm not going to read all the quotes I have, but I'll certainly have them available if people would like more detail after. So there were 4 key themes that emerged. By far and away, the predominant theme that emerged was that employment supports are vital. Now imagine how we felt about this when the whole purpose of our study was to say, that's another piece of the puzzle. How do we support you as the employers? And all of our stakeholder groups, including employers, said, you know what, these employment supports are really key. So that's great news for people that work in that field. That's actually great news for some of the funding that Canada is putting into those sorts of resources. But it really surprised us. And it didn't come down so much to those employers saying, we want the employment supports so we can feel more capable. It was really, this helps us feel really comfortable. And one thing that really emerged was that all stakeholder groups, including employers, felt very, very comforted by those employment supports that were ongoing, even if they never, ever, ever used them after the first month. So we know that not all employment support models have ongoing funding involved, right? Some models, once a job is found and retained for a certain amount of time, then that funding goes away. But what our stakeholders across groups, including employers, said is we actually think it's really important to have this at our fingertips, a phone call away, if we need it, even if they never used it. So if you're advocating for a job or some sort of funding support, having that piece is probably an important piece to consider. The second piece that came through was that all stakeholder groups agreed that disability education and understanding was appreciated and helpful. Heather talked a little bit about that study that said people were 3 times more likely to get a job or keep a job. Okay, if they disclose their diagnosis. But I think we all recognize that disclosing a diagnosis is a choice. It's not a requirement. But what our stakeholders said was that education and understanding disability was really helpful. So whether that be, here's what you need to know about me, here's some of my sensory sensitivities, here's some of my social nuance, if I offend you, please tell me. Those sorts of education pieces can be helpful, or broad disability awareness and diversity awareness was also deemed to be helpful should people not want to disclose. A lot of this came back to perceptions of stereotypes by employers, also by colleagues who we did not interview for this study. And they also appreciated education and understanding around inclusion and disability and not hiring people as a form of sort of charity or the good thing. Our fourth theme came around to accommodations, and there was a really big discrepancy amongst our stakeholders. Our employers were quite well informed, but many did acknowledge that they overestimated the extent and the cost of accommodations that would be required. And then our other participant groups also highlighted that this was still an ongoing issue, that when they proposed supporting someone with autism in a workplace, that employers almost always overestimated the extent and cost of accommodations, whether that be in training or in actual physical or job accommodations to the job. So that's something as well to be aware of if you are advocating for a job somewhere, just to be really upfront and maybe highlight, you know, if I need accommodations, they're going to be X, Y, and Z, and they're going to be this limited and cost this much if they're not a huge amount. So highlighting that and putting that up front, because that was a really big barrier to employers employing someone with autism. And the final theme that emerged from our study was related to visible versus invisible disability. The first thing we'll highlight is perspectives really did vary between groups here and within groups. So there were lots of differing opinions within persons with autism or developmental disability, within employers, within employment supports. Now, the one thing that was quite consistent was, and Heather, you sort of talked about this, was that people with invisible disability, which did include most of our participants with a diagnosis of autism, felt like it was easier to get a job if they could get through the interview process. Doesn't mean getting a job was easy, but it was easier with an invisible disability. But once they had a job, they felt like it was harder to keep that job because people said, well, you don't look disabled, so we're not going to accept sort of this social nuance or these other potential differences. And so what often came down was that disclosure was a key consideration, and that people with invisible disability very much felt pressure to disclose. Many people from other stakeholder groups, caregivers, employment supports, and employers, they all agreed that they thought that disclosing the diagnosis would be helpful. But again, just recognizing that that's a choice and not everyone wants to. And the literature for whether or not it actually is helpful is really lacking. So we don't have good evidence to say, you don't feel great about this, but you know what, it's going to help you. We don't have that evidence yet. So just to revisit our 4 key themes, the predominant theme was that employment supports were vital, but again, that sort of went against our study because that's still primarily employee, not employer focused. And so whether that's reflecting sort of the employment world that people are familiar with and just sort of what they're aware of, or whether that really is the most helpful thing moving onward. I found that a little bit concerning because I would like to see a world where we don't have to sort of rely on employment supports. But for those of you going out there, just to know that they actually are appreciated and valued. And then the other three areas around accommodations, education and understanding disability, and visible versus invisible disability, those are really promising processes that are actually focused sort of on those external factors that I think that we can make a lot of progress in. So there's lots of room for practice and research in this area, but I think there's a lot of promise there. And I guess the one thing I will say that I forgot to say at the beginning was in our interviews, people highlighted things that had been struggles for them, but we had a lot of really positive success stories. So they are absolutely out there from across the country. So what are sort of the next practical steps from this? Now we're just getting into these data, but what we see is it really does seem like those skill building pieces that we've invested so much time in are a really key piece of the puzzle, but that we have to increase this education, whether that be person-specific, employer-specific, and at a broader societal level. We really have to sort of ramp up that awareness around autism in particular and broader disability. It does seem that employer networks might be a key part to this. So the one thing that I forgot to say in one of the slides was around incentives. So are you all aware what incentive programs are? So our stakeholders, almost all of them were actually quite against incentives. They didn't feel good about it because they felt like it minimized the actual contribution that that employee would make in and of itself, that it devalued that. One of our employees had sort of I found it a bit of an amusing idea, but maybe not a bad one, is don't incentivize people to hire Joe with autism. Incentivize those employers who see how valuable these employees are to recruit other employers to hire people. Sort of almost like a pyramid scheme, it seemed. But I thought, I kind of like the idea of spreading the word, because they did say they felt like employer to employer advocacy was going to be more effective than other. Sorry, I lost my slide. And then for policy implications, we haven't got there yet, but we are trying to think sort of big picture, because there are lots of policies and funding around these Community Works, Employment Works, Worktopia, all those programs. So how can this maybe be a piece of that puzzle? So we're still thinking about that. Thank you.